Well, this is an exciting couple of chapters that we're going to be looking at, Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Exciting because, again, they give us insight into what's happening now in preparation for what will happen in the future as the Lord brings his kingdom to the earth. What we see in this chapter is a ultimate victory, is what I've called it. A prophecy about Gog and Magog. Now, often chapters 38 and 39 are presented as if they were one war. If you're familiar with this area of Scripture, you know what I'm talking about here. Chapters 38 and 39, Gog and Magog, and coming against Israel are often presented as one war, and there's good reason for that. One reason is that the same leaders in the nations are involved in both chapters. In chapter 38, verse 2, and chapter 39, verse 1, you're going to find Gog, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal are all mentioned. I'll tell you what these nations are today when we get to these sections. But another reason sometimes people treat these as one war is that God takes some of the same actions against these nations. So we find in chapter 38, verse 4, God says he's going to turn them around and bring them against Israel. It's repeated in chapter 39, verse 2. Also, the events in chapters 38 and 39, they both occur in what's called the latter days in chapter 38, verse 8, or the last days in verse 16, or on that day, repeatedly in chapters 38 and 39, and on the day in chapter 39, verses 8 through 13. So it's all pointing to these latter days. This, what I discussed before, is this period of time that's really the end of history. However, I take a different view. That's a very popular view, that this is one war. Some also take the view that this war could happen before the rapture of the church. I don't think that's the case, but be that as it may, let me give you some reasons why it's good to see these two chapters as two separate wars. One reason is in that chapter 38, verse 1, and verses 2 to 3, and verse 5. It lists invaders that are from both the north and the south of Israel. But when we come to chapter 39, verses 1 and 2, and in verse 6 and verse 11, we only see nations coming against Israel from the north. Not from the north and south, but only from the north. In chapter 38, Israel is attacked while it is secure, while it's safe in the land. And in order for them to be safe in the land, there needs to be some sort of agreement or covenant in place. So the events of chapter 38, I think, fit well with what we know about the tribulation period, where there's going to be a peace treaty made to begin that sets off the 7 years of tribulation. Peace treaty that's made with a prince or a leader from a Roman empire, Roman-based empire. And in the middle of that peace, 3.5 years in, the peace is broken. Israel's restored, sacrifice is ended, and a war breaks out. So I think chapter 38 aligns well with the first part of the tribulation. Whereas at the end of the events of 39, where we see the defeat of Gog, the burning of weapons, the burial of the dead, and then the carnage from the battle being eaten by birds and beasts. And then finally the restore of Israel. I think that flow of events fits better with the end of the tribulation. So I take the view that we're looking at two wars. The war of Ezekiel 38 happens in the middle of the tribulation. The war of Ezekiel 39 at the end. It's my view. You don't have to agree. Lots of people, I know it's a minority view, but I'd invite you to study it more closely, not to dismiss it out of hand. I've outlined this chapter Verses 1 through 6 is the invaders. 7 through 9 is the preparation for invasion, and 10 through 13 is the purpose of the invasion. Verses 14 through 16 then discuss in a summary way the invasion itself, and then the defeat in verses 17 through 23. So that's our outline for today. Again, what I do is I have a wider margin Bible. I don't have that here in front of me, but I have a wider margin Bible. And I put the outline in the wide margin to the right or to the left of the passage to help guide me through it. You might want to consider doing that and marking up what are typically clean pages in your Bible, the Old Testament. So if we look at verse 2 then, we see these nations that are summoned for war. Now I'm going to lay these nations out, and you can see what the events that are happening today are really setting the stage for what's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation. So I think Gog is a title, or perhaps even a proper name, which means ruler. He's the ruler of Magog. Magog is an area that's in the news a lot lately. This is Russia, a part of Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. So that is biblical Magog, is that area. Rosh is an area that scholars understand to be modern Iran. And the prince of Rosh could be translated the chief prince, so that chief prince of this land of Rosh is being addressed here. That country of Iran is going to be brought against Israel. Meshach and Tubal are modern-day Turkey. Persia is modern-day Iran. As you work your way through these verses here, they're listing the nations. Ethiopia, literally, in the NASB, it's translated Ethiopia. Literally, it's Cush in the Bible in Hebrew. And that's northern Sudan in the modern times. So if you look on a map, it's northern Sudan. Put is modern day Libya, so North Africa, west of Egypt. Gomer is a portion of Turkey and another portion of the Ukraine. And Beth Togarmah is modern-day Turkey, the area that's near the border of Syria. So that's what we find in verses 2 through 6, as these nations are being summoned for war against Israel. Verse 7 to 9 is this preparation for invasion, and God is communicating to this invading coalition that they need to prepare for war. Verse 8, after many days you will be summoned in the latter years. So this is many days from Ezekiel's time, specifically in the latter years. Again, this is pointing to the end of history. It says, you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely in all of them. So, this is presupposing Israel's restoration to the land. We've talked about this before. This is the fulfillment, the new covenant. It's in the process, not new covenant, the land covenant. I think the process is happening now. It's going to take a while for these Jewish people to return to their land. But currently, about 60% of the 15 million Jews that are in the world are in Israel. And that's a process that's accelerating. It's called Aliyah, going up, return. The process is accelerating. It's being driven by the outbreak of anti-Semitism around the world. It's being driven by relatively low birth rates among Jews outside of Israel and relatively high birth rates among Jews in Israel. So this is the preparation for invasion that's happening. Preparation among the nations who God is calling against Israel, as well as preparing Israel for this attack, getting them ready for when they're back in the land. Verses 10 through 13 delineate the purpose of the invasion. And take a look closely here. We see God's sovereignty in verse 10. Although the coalition, they are apparently thinking up the invasion themselves as far as they know, it's really in accordance with a plan that God has put in place and that he is bringing about. He is going to fulfill his prophecy, and God is acting sovereignly to do that. Again, verse 11 indicates that not only are they all secure, as the end of verse 8 says, but they are living at peace. They are defenseless. They are at rest. They are secure. Verses 12 through 13 says that the reason for the attack is to secure wealth, capture and seize wealth. And finally, as you go through this section, I want you to point out that God refers to Israel as the people who live at the center of the world. What a view God has of the earth that we don't have. We view the United States as the center of the earth. Or perhaps, I know I have some people who watch this in Brazil. Perhaps you look at it as the center. Brazil is the center of the earth. Or viewers in England. But God views the map of the world with Israel at the center. Reminds me of Deuteronomy 32:8, where it says that he separated the sons of man and set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. Think about that for a moment. He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. In fact, what it's saying there is that God has arranged the nations of the earth in relation to Israel, his people. Drop down to verses 17 through 23, then we see the defeat. Verse 17 is interesting in the Hebrew Bible. It's posed as a question, and I think it's somewhat rhetorical, asking the leader of this coalition, are you one of whom I spoke in former days through my servants the prophets? In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this is not posed as a question, but rather as a statement, stating that it is Gog, in fact, who is the instrument that the prophet spoke of. And I think this is capturing the thrust of this verse, that God is saying that Gog is the leader of this group that he's put in place. Verses 19 through 23, then we see the instruments of the coalition's defeat. So this northern and southern attack on Israel is going to be brought to nothing by the hand of God. And we see how God does that. Verse 19 talks about earthquakes. Verse 20 talks about severe topographic and structural destruction of Israel or the land. Verse 21, inter-coalition warfare breaks out. There's no love lost today between the Ukraine and Russia, or between Turkey and elements in northern Syria. That this is a very fragile coalition, and under the pressure of war and the pressure of God's judgment, the inter-coalition or civil war breaks out among them. Disease, verse 22, weather, and also supernatural destruction are all listed in verses 22 as instruments God uses to bring this first war of Ezekiel 38 to a close. By way of application, think of a couple things. Number one, we really need to understand and depend on the sovereignty of God. He is sovereign in history. He is sovereign in salvation. God determines who will be saved, and he determines the actions that were going to be carried out in history. If this were not true, then we would have no certainty of the fulfillment of God's prophetic word. But we can be sure, and we can rejoice, and we can refrain or avoid denying God's sovereignty, seeing all that's at stake based on his sovereign purposes and plan. Another application for us today is that the world is not falling apart, but rather the world is falling into place. That God himself is working in history, orchestrating the events that we're witnessing today. And ultimately, he is going to magnify, sanctify, and reveal himself when what's being put in place today comes to its ultimate purpose and conclusion and outcome. So be certain in God's sovereignty, brothers and sisters, and be certain that the world is falling in place by God's sovereign hand. God bless you.